Good morning, everyone. And we want to thank you for coming to our second Professor Circle for this semester, where we are taking deep dives into what it means to be a minority serving institution. As we did last month, we have two amazing presenters and experts and people who are passionate about this subject. And we are certainly happy to have them here again this month and next month. One of the things that I want to tell you is for next month, our series, Professor Circle series, we are hoping, fingers crossed, that it will be in person. And the original invitations that you may have received or announcements would indicate that we were going to be here in the Student Union. However, we thought that it would be really appropriate to take that last series for the semester to the Faculty Center. So you all will be receiving updates as to exactly where that is going to be. But for right now, it's in the Faculty Center. And we're excited about that. So without any further ado, because I know that Blanca and Doris have some very important and exciting information to share with us this morning on enacting servingness and what that is in terms of the faculty role. And so I'm going to turn this over to them. And thank you again so much for being here this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Barlow, and hello and welcome to the second of a three-part series on understanding MSIs. Today we'll begin with a discussion about what it means to enact servingness as administrative and academic faculty. And so for those of you who weren't here last time, my name is Blanca Ricon, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education. And my research agenda lies at the intersection of access and success for students of color and understanding how higher education environments shape the important student outcomes, including the environments at enrollment-based MSIs. And I'm gonna put in a shameless plug here and let you all know that I will be teaching Understanding MSIs this spring for those of you who might be interested in taking a deeper dive into some of these topics. And now I'm gonna allow Dr. Watson to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing well on this beautiful fall day in Las Vegas. This is one of the reasons why I love living here. I am Doris Watson, and I'm a professor in higher education. My research interests in the areas of exploring or investigating campus climate at minority serving institutions, doctoral student mentoring, and recently I've been involved the last 2 years on a project using oral history in the exploration of Black and Latinx teachers in Clark County School District. And that work we've just now begun the expansion of that work to include oral histories of Black and Latinx faculty members. We both want to give a special shout out always to Dr. Barlow, Dr. B, lovingly as I refer to her as, for inviting us to begin these conversations about what it means for UNLV to become a minority serving institution and what it means for UNLV faculty and our administrative staff faculty to serve Latino, and Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and other students of color on campus. So thank you so much. So as Dr. B and Blanca indicated, this is the second of the part series of workshops on better understanding minority serving institutions. In September, we unpacked the foundations of what it means to be a minority serving institution, looking at the definitions and designations and the emergence of this designation and these types of institutions on the larger higher education landscape. As also noted a few minutes ago, on November 3rd will be our third and final session of the Professor Circle, and we will unpack becomingness to servingness, utilizing existing faculty initiatives here at UNLV to illuminate what that looks like. We really hope that you can join us. Friend, you
You,
are muted.
yes, I know. It was, my computer was telling me, like, stop talking, you're muted. So I want to take this time to acknowledge and honor the traditional homelands of the Nuwuvi Southern Paiute people by actually taking this time to further our learning of these communities. So some of the things that I want to share with you all is that the Southern Paiute people have called the desert Southwest home for at least as far back as 1100 AD. The Moapa River Indian reservation consists of 71,000 acres and is located near Moapa Town, Nevada, located in the Moapa Valley between Lake Mead and Valley of Fire State Park. The Las Vegas Paiute Tribe Reservation sits on about 4,000 acres and is located about 18 miles northwest of downtown Las Vegas in the Snow Mountain area. So as we consider what it means to serve our UNLV students today, I also want to highlight things that some of our NC institutions are doing towards enacting this servingness. So in 2019, the University of Nevada, Reno offered its first ever Paiute language course, which sought to preserve Paiute language and culture and serves as a world language requirement for students.
Thank you, Blanca. So on the agenda for today, we have a number of items. We're super excited to host this discussion with you all. Initially, we want to unpack campus climate, or specifically address what and how enrollment-based minority-serving institutions can and do feel like for Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Island students, faculty, and staff, as well as other BIPOC folks. And I'm going to hit a pause real quick there. Do folks understand the use of the term BIPOC? BIPOC collectively is Black, Indigenous, people of color. Just don't want to assume. Secondly, we want to unpack campus climate from the lens of Diane Gusa's work, which focuses on the concept of white institutional presence. We then want to take a deep dive into the concept of servingness, utilizing the work of Gina Garcia's, using her framework, the typology of Hispanic serving institutions, organizational identities. We then want to transition into using examples from our own research on how UNLV can begin or continue to enact servingness on our campus. And then we will certainly have time at the conclusion for questions and comments.
So we'd like to begin with the refresher of sorts by reflecting on some of what we learned in our first session. So we're going to pose a few questions to y'all and invite you to respond using the chat box. So the first question we'll pose is, what does it mean to be designated as a minority serving institution?
Not all at once now.
Right, it means you enroll a specific percentage of identified groups. Yes, it's something that institutions need to apply for. So we're talking mainly about the federal designation, these race conscious designations that institutions apply for.
Yep. Nicely done, Provost Heavey. There is a threshold for those definitions in terms, in regards to qualifying for federal financial aid.
And I would add also that when we talk about minority serving institutions, we're also talking about a large umbrella of institutions. Thank you, Christine. So including HSIs and ANAPISIs.
Excellent.
And yes, the designation could be lost. So,
Mhm.
All right, Dr. Watson.
Well done, folks. So the second question, and I'm going to actually put it in the chat box. Question number 2 is, why do we differentiate between mission-based and enrollment-based MSIs? And what is the salience? Come on, my beautiful colleagues. What is the differentiation between mission-based and enrollment-based MSIs? Here we go. Yes, mission-based designation is purposeful in that it is those institutions, their mission is to primarily uphold the cultures of African American, African diaspora, and indigenous peoples. Yes. Began as their enrollment focus. So, okay, so they're all coming through. You can help, Doctor. I cannot keep up with what's coming through. And indeed, so mission-based institutions are historically were created to serve, again, as I said, African American, African diaspora, and indigenous folks. So examples of those institutions are HBCUs and TCUs, or tribal colleges and universities. Enrollment-based institutions, again, are institutions that have reached an enrollment threshold as it pertains to Latinx students or Asian American Pacific Islander students. And so when we talk about, and what we talked a little bit last in September in our previous session, is the nature in which a mission-based addresses and leans into how they serve their student populations is decidedly different than institutions that met an enrollment threshold and became a minority serving institution, which really does lead us into our conversation. To begin our discussion this morning, we want to talk about, again, sussing out the enrollment-based minority serving institutions, remembering that they can, although they have been designated as an MSI, enrollment-based MSIs can remain as PWIs, as that designation is based solely on enrollment thresholds. And these institutions are simultaneously, also they reside on historically white colleges or university campuses. We want to use Diane Goose's work and make a special note that although her work does explore the salience of race at predominantly white institutions, we do believe that it's applicable to most enrollment-based MSIs as these organizations grapple with servingness. The persistence of marginalization and discrimination in policies and practices result in maintaining white mainstream ideology or whiteness and white privilege, and what Goose defines as white institutional presence. Whiteness is thus positioned as normative, and education is positioned as neutral or objective. There are 4 attributes of white institutional presence that are intricately linked and or interrelated. We are providing a general overview of each here today, but we encourage you to read the work of Diane Goose for a deeper examination on your own time. Star asterisk, that is homework, y'all. The first attribute of white institutional presence is white ascendancy. This reflects social behavior and arises from white mainstream authority and advantage, which are generated from whiteness's historical position of power and dominance, i.e., where there is Black progress, there is the belief that there will be white loss. Examples include when white students and faculty question diversity requirements, verbal comments and insults, or question the authority and scholarship of faculty of color. My personal experiences, and I know that of Dr. Ricon, mirror those of Goose's examples in her work, in which white students respond, quote, "We challenged what she had to say. We didn't accept everything she said word for word. We spoke our minds and we don't think she liked it." These open challenges experienced in both the classroom as well as on course evaluations regularly occur to myself and Dr. Ricon to present day. Monoculturalism, the second attribute of white institutional presence, is the expectation to conform to one scholarly worldview and stems from the belief in white as normal. This reflects organizational behavior as well as facets of an institution's practices and policies. For example, for our purposes for this conversation this morning, we want to unpack this definition in light of research and teaching. So in terms of research, I quote from a recent definition taken from the US Department of Health and Human Services, quote, "The following activities are deemed not to be research: scholarly and journalistic activities, including oral history, journalism, biography, literary criticism, legal research, and historical scholarship." This is a very sound example of this particular attribute in the area of research. Teaching and curriculum example would constitute what the canon or what is considered as foundational in a discipline. And an example from our own home discipline of higher education takes into account also how this knowledge is positioned. So for example, in higher education, we are starting to see the repositioning of what used to be referred to as the colonial colleges, i.e. Harvard and Princeton, and those colleges are being referenced and reframed as colonizing colleges for the lasting impact and effect of their influence today in higher education. Similarly, in September, Blanca and I spoke to the emergence of MSIs, HSIs, and the connection to the Moral Acts 1 and 2, which established land grants institutions in the US. In the field of higher education, the push to challenge the narrative that these were wonderful things that provided us with land to produce and develop land grant institutions is to question and critique where did that land come from, i.e. indigenous folks, and thus we see the proliferation of land acknowledgement statements at universities. The third example of white institutional presence is white blindness. And this is based on the principle of color blindness and reflects the belief that race of a person is or ought to be immaterial. Examples include "I don't see color," which really hones in on the work of Eduardo Bonilla Silva. His work, Racism Without Racists, a must read for all, his work is data-driven and found that it is very common for most white folks to adhere to an ideology of color blindness. In so doing, this effectively delegitimizes racism and its impact on BIPOC folks as whiteness becomes further invisible. Again, here, folks, you see the interrelatedness of these concepts relative to white institutional presence at work, as when we take the sum total of white blindness and white ascendancy together, if there is no color, then white normalcy reigns. In the realm of administrative trainings, an example for our administrative folks joining us today would be diversity trainings on how BIPOC folks experience hostile or chilly climates. These sessions often include recommendations or strategies for how BIPOC folks what they can do to feel safe and better or less stressful. I.e., we refer to this as putting on a metaphorical jacket to address the chilly climate. This does not address the underlying source of these issues, which is systemic racism and the proliferation and maintenance of white supremacy. The fourth attribute of white institutional presence, folks, is white estrangement. And this refers to the distancing of white folks socially and physically from BIPOC folks. Now, a note I made in specific in our last session about one of the things I really dig about being at UNLV, I refer to the naturally occurring diversity at UNLV in the SU in particular during lunchtimes, as I see lots of different students interacting. I think there is certainly the likelihood and the nature we know to be true that our students engage with lots of different others. This is testimony to our most recent establishing ourselves as the #1 most diverse campus, which that is the question that these folks are asked, these students are asked. But we suggest and posit that across campus and within units, staff and faculty, that there is a lack of interaction and thus the persistence of white estrangement, as we do not have sufficient numbers of diversity in terms of faculty and staff. Again, folks, the 4 aspects of white institutional presence are intricately linked, and in the sum total can and do negatively impact a positive campus climate and thus a positive campus experience. One way to begin to address the white institutional presence at an MSI that is enrollment-based is the consideration and subsequent application of Garcia's framework, the typology of HSI organizational identities. Her work is empirical work based on a 4-year HSI. The typology is not stage-based and is not or has not been used presently in rankings for HSIs. The 4 quadrants, folks, were generated on the basis of interviews that she conducted. And what emerged from her data were 2 key points. One addressed the organizational outcome of institutions that would be ideally serving students, and the other facet was organizational culture. So you'll note on the diagram that you are looking at, the x-axis is organizational culture, which reflects the type of environment that supports Latinx students. And then the y-axis is organizational outcomes for Latinx students. And this reflects graduation and career readiness. What I'd like to do is unpack this diagram a little bit and provide you with a definition of each of the quadrants. Noting that as my tongue continues to be tied this morning, that for all definitions, the institution has met the minimum requirement to have the designation as HSI. So Latinx enrollment in the bottom left-hand quadrant, institution has met the enrollment of Latinx students, but they are not producing equitable outcomes, i.e. graduation, and there is also a lack of the organizational culture that would support Latinx students. When you shift your gaze up to Latinx producing quadrant, these institutions are characterized as being effective in graduating and training Latinx students for careers. However, these institutions would be characterized as lacking an organizational culture that supports the development of Latinx students. If you shift your gaze to the lower right-hand quadrant, Latinx enhancing definition these institutions do draw on the cultural practices and norms to support Latinx students. However, their outcomes in terms of graduation and career readiness fall short. And then last but not least is the Latinx serving quadrant. And these are institutions that simultaneously produce equitable outcomes for Latinx students, as well as provide cultural underpinnings to support these students. Of note for both Blanca and I to you all is that although Gina Garcia's work has addressed and situates most squarely and keenly on Hispanic serving institutions, we believe that there is applicability to use this framework for minority serving institutions more generally.
So we have a lot of models for you all today. And you're going to be learning a lot about Garcia. So Dr. Garcia's work. So Garcia et al. Extends Garcia's typology of HSI organizational identities by providing insight into how the field of higher education has operationalized the concept of servingness. So while the previous framework focused on where an institution might fall in terms of indicators for serving, this framework focuses on the levers of, for change at an institution, right? Or what they call structures for serving, which I highlight using the red arrow in this picture, that can further an institution's ability to enact servingness. What's important to note here is that this is a model that is focused on institutional transformation. It challenges us to take action. It also is a model that's focused on an individual institution. So the way in which an institution enacts servingness will look different given the unique characteristics of the institution itself, as well as the context, right? So let me give you some examples. So UNLV is a Hispanic serving research institution, and it's also an ANAPISI, right? As one of a few HSRIs, we are uniquely positioned to consider what it means to serve via research. And my light's gonna turn off, so I'm gonna wave at my door. So for example, community engaged research with and for the community might be one way that we might think about utilizing our research focus as a highly selective research institution and in connection with our MSI designation. We can also consider what it means to serve through our reach into the Las Vegas community, right? So if most of our students are from Las Vegas, then serving our local community would be one way of serving our students. What constitutes the H will also look different based on where an institution is located, right? And this is where data disaggregation efforts are really helpful in gaining better insight into the specific AAPI and Latinx subgroups we serve at UNLV. For example, at UNLV, the H may mean a predominantly Mexican and Central American student body, whereas on the East Coast, an HSI or the H at an HSI might look very different. It might be more Puerto Rican and Dominican students that we're serving. Similarly, who comprises the AAPI, right, group will also look different based on where an institution is located. Here, this may be a larger number of Native Hawaiian students than in the Midwest, where we might have a larger number of Hmong students, right? So I think that's important to think about servingness in being like context driven, okay? And so returning to this model, I want to bring your attention to the center of the model, and this oval reflects the various organizational and cultural elements of an institution. And I want to focus on two examples here that are relevant to our work as faculty to demonstrate how it's as much about what we do as it is about how we do them. And this is important because I think as these, as what it means to serve becomes more important at an institution, often we think about like new initiatives, and that's important, right? But there are also folks on this campus who have been doing this work for a really long time, and their role in doing this work has been marginalized. And so how do we support folks who are already doing this work? So when I think about programs and services, right, and thinking about like the how we do this work, we might start first with an equity-centric use of data to identify equity gaps in the programs and services across the university, right? So things we already do. And maybe we raise questions like, does our honors college reflect the racial diversity of students on campus? Or what do retention metrics look like along the lines of race, gender, and class? And I think here, when I talk about data disaggregation efforts as it relates to equity, this ties to the idea that we can't be responsive if we don't know who our students are and what those needs may be, right? So we can't serve if we don't know who our students are and where there might be equity gaps. And Estela Ben-Simone's equity scorecard tool is a really useful tool to start engaging in some of that work. Another area that I want to emphasize is around curriculum and pedagogy. So if we're thinking about like, how do we train and prepare faculty to engage in culturally relevant and responsive practices? That's great, we should be doing that, right? But how do we go about doing this work is also important. So how do we engage faculty of color with expertise as partners in developing such an effort, right? So often the assumption is that anyone can do equity work, but we soon come to find that it's very difficult. And oftentimes equity-based efforts can create more harm than good when we don't consider the how in that process. Okay, so I wanted to share that because I think it's important. Oftentimes we get really caught up in the what we're doing and don't really think about how we're doing it, which is just as important. So ultimately, these structures for serving are things that can be manipulated or changed in order to achieve important educational aims or these indicators for serving. And so here you can see the three boxes at the bottom with arrows pointing down. And this includes both student and non-student level outcomes. So there are things that pertain to faculty and staff, including things like validating experiences within structures as well as racialized experiences. Importantly, this framework moves us beyond using traditional metrics for student achievement. as an institution, as folks work in higher education, we're often concerned with retention, graduation, and GPA as metrics for student success. But we also need to think about non-academic outcomes that lead us towards those metrics, right? So developing students' racial identity, social justice orientations, and civic engagement might also be important non-academic metrics that we might consider as important as an institution that is trying to serve. This framework also accounts for the institutional environment, or how we might create positive campus climates that are free from racial discrimination, harassment, microaggressions, and instead are culturally validating and affirming. So I shared with Dr. Watson just yesterday, a student in my graduate class shared how it was affirming to hear me use Spanish. Although I do it very limited in class, she said that my using Spanish, even as a non-Spanish speaker, made her feel that she could bring her whole authentic self in the classroom, and raised her comfort in asking questions and making contributions in the classroom. So this is another way that we might think about what it looks like to affirm students by us just being our authentic selves in the classroom. And so another thing that I want to share here is, and that is not depicted, but I think that this needs to be a part of the conversation, is how we hold ourselves accountable, right? How do we align our values as it relates to servingness to important metrics, whether that includes tenure and promotion, student grades, or other metrics that we use on campus. And I want to echo some of what Dr. Watson said about how this framework is based on the literature on HSIs, and how there are opportunities for this framework to support other enrollment-based MSIs, such as those serving Black or African-American, Native, and Asian American Pacific Islander students. But there are also things that we have to consider that might be missing, given that this framework has been focused on Latinx students. And I'll add that most of the literature we're drawing on in these talks are HSI specific, because HSIs have just been around longer, right? So there has just been more time in our field to study and theorize what it means to be an HSI. And so in the next slides, we'll continue to talk more about servingness.
Thank you, Blanca. So I want to take a minute to unpack two studies that will be forthcoming. One is a book chapter in an edited book through Dio Press, and the other is a manuscript that will be published in the spring, we've recently been told. Both studies utilize large data sets across two institutions at an institution in the Desert Southwest. Collectively, I'm going to speak about the studies as a collective, because they were certainly related. So both studies looked at, the purpose of the study was to examine the perceptions of campus climate of students, faculty, and staff as their institutions transitioned to minority serving status designation, thus the title of the slide, in a state of enrolling. Campus climate was defined as the extent to which the campus was perceived as open, friendly, communicative, and improving. The studies were both multiple case study designs utilizing the transformational tapestry model by Ricon and Reason that investigates or explores the campus climate from 6 areas on campus, including access and retention, research and scholarship, inter and intra-group relations, community relations, curriculum, and university policies and services. The campus, each study, participants included for the first study, we had participants, 10 were students, 10 were faculty, and 10 were staff. For the second study, participants included 12 student affairs administrators, 4 at the entry level, 4 mid-level administrators, and 4 senior level administrators. I'm going to summarize the findings from a cross-case analysis in the interest of time, and also as it relates to the salience of this presentation. There were 4 key findings across both studies, generally speaking. All of us in research know that what I'm doing is a grave generalization, but y'all hang with me. The first finding was institutional intentionality. And this was the expressed communication of the participants across both studies, noting that it was important to embrace the designation of minority serving institution, either as HSI or Asian American Pacific Island, and not to just be about enrolling or having the numbers of students. Institutional diversity was the second finding and related to the awareness of folks regarding the lack of faculty and staff diversity and culturally responsive teaching practices and practices in general on that campus. The third finding was institutional leadership, and this was recognition of our study participants that existed on the campus relative to the tension of being both a doctoral granting institution that was moving to a tier 1 status and a minority serving institution with a regional and somewhat open access mission. Acknowledgement of what that tension felt like was expressed. And then the fourth finding was minority serving institution awareness. And this was the importance our participants felt in the promotion of MSI to the surrounding communities, and that was viewed as being imperative as a way to better support both students, staff, and faculty on campus. Campus climate is reflective of institutional artwork and what that artwork signals to faculty and students and staff, as well as to our communities. Beautiful people. I'm in my teacher mode. This is how I address my students. Beautiful people. If you look at the mural, the diagram or the picture noted in this slide, this is the winner of the call for artwork that would be student generated from our graduate college that reflects what it means to be on a minority serving institution campus. I suggest to you that if we apply both Diane Goose's work on white institutional presence, as well as the framework of Gina Garcia, the mural falls short. And I think for myself, the takeaway from these studies in light of those applications would be, it is incredibly important for us to be intentional about how we serve our students, staff, and faculty at a minority serving institution, or to utilize Goose's work, we risk stumbling into white blindness at best or racial erasure at worst. As you'll note on this mural, we do not see faces of the individuals that are surrounding the table. At worst, folks, we continue to be situated as an enrolling institution rather than a serving institution, where we substitute equality in place of equity. We always remember that when that happens, few are served well.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. And so some of the work that I'm going to share with you today is actually work that I've engaged in my Understanding MSIs class with my students. And so some of the impetus for this work has been, my own experiences, including coming from, the University of Connecticut prior to being faculty here at UNLV. And when I came on campus, I always thought to myself, like, what would it feel like? Like, I knew UNLV was an MSI when I started here, but did it feel like an MSI? And this was something that students who are in my class would always talk about. And given that I study institutional environments, I sought out to think about, well, what would it look like to study the physical elements of the campus environment as it relates to communicating servingness, right? So thinking about size, layout, artwork, university web pages, right? So this research examined the extent to which an institution's campus artifacts spoke to their HSI and ANAPZ designations. For example, we asked questions like, what is depicted in the artifact? Is it Latinx or AAPI centric? Does it speak to diversity? Is it equity centric? And I think the Latinx and AAPI centric is really important, because I think when we talk about MSI efforts, we typically talk about MSI as a blanket, as opposed to the HSI and ANAPZ designations. And I think that there's something that's being communicated there as it relates to wanting to distance ourselves from these designations. So I really want you all to think about, as you're engaging in this work, why am I using MSI? Why do I feel more comfortable saying MSI as opposed to NAPZ or HSI, okay? And so in addition to those questions that we asked who created the imagery? Where is it located? To what extent is there a sense of permanence in this imagery? So we can also apply that practice here at UNLV, right? So I have two pictures here of a mural that we recently put up on campus. And I want to engage us in this practice, in a similar practice, right? As to ask these questions around what does this campus artifact communicate? Because the physical environment of an institution is the first messaging students receive when they step on campus, right? About who we are. So when we look at these murals, we might come to the conclusion that there is an equity-centric position to public art, such as murals, right? That are for public consumption. There might also be cultural significance, as large-scale mural artwork is common in places like LA, San Antonio, Mexico City, right? And the murals themselves were also designed by two of our own art students, including so Annie Lynn and Brian Martinez. So that within itself represents an equity-centric position, right? Students have ownership of the imagery that they're consuming on campus. Portrayed in the actual imagery itself, we might focus on what's being depicted, right? So the pictures demonstrate a focus on community and the environment. So, and that's important, right? Because the purpose of the surplus store where this mural is located is to recycle. So the imagery includes community members who frequent the surplus center, as well as folks who work there. And then we might ask, like, well, where is this mural located? And a quick search would tell you that it's located on the corner of Maryland and Flamingo. So we might argue that it's located on the outskirts of campus as compared to artwork we might find on the quad itself or on the student union, right? And so that's communicating something, because maybe students won't be likely to run into the artwork, right? And then finally, we might ask ourselves, to what extent is it permanent? And we might conclude that there's a certain level of permanence to painting on the walls. Certainly the walls can be painted over, but that would take more effort than simply taking down a banner, such as the Black Lives Matter banner we also have on campus. Okay, so getting back to the research that was conducted, what we found was that institutions were trying to make steps towards celebrating diversity. And these were like largely blanket diversity focused initiatives and not like specific to AAPI and Latinx communities. And while these institutions were looking more like the communities that they served, there were competing artifacts on campus that represented racial exclusion and white dominance that weren't being dealt with, right? And weren't being acknowledged, and that were arguably more permanent. So what did that look like? Well, we had slogans, right, that said like, we are, institution, that tried to speak to like community, but all of the communication was in English, right? We also, some of these institutions also had pictures of staff or faculty of color on their walls, but next to them, there was also pictures of an almost all white governing board. That reflects different power dynamics, right? So I think we have to contend with both. It can't just be that we're like adding things. It can't just be about inclusion. It has to contend with our history as a historically white institution and some of the artifacts that depict that history and try to contend and make this a learning opportunity. And I guess really here, the takeaway is because most colleges and universities were not designed with all students in mind, we're tasked really with deconstructing and reconstructing campus environments, including the physical environments, in order to better serve a diverse student body.
Thank you, Blanca. So in summary, folks, we want to return to the typology of Dr. Garcia, servingness. We've unpacked campus climate from the perspective of Dr. Goose's work white institutional presence as situated in Servingness. So this is a summary conclusion and simultaneously a priming for our third session in November. And we want to leave you with the question of what we want you to consider is where you and the work you're involved in might be in terms of the quadrant using Dr. Garcia's work. Does your program enroll, produce, serve students of color, recognizing that across campus servingness will look differently? I speak for Blanca in that we wholeheartedly want to enact an atmosphere of calling in and not calling out on our campus, across our campus, as this is in support to only provide for the likelihood of truly enacting servingness at UNLV. At this point in time, beautiful folks, we would like to take questions and comments. And I think it's okay, Blanca, if you go ahead and stop sharing. Oh, now I can see everyone. Right on.
Is it okay to speak on the mic, or do you want
Yes,
to
sir.
do that? Okay,
Yes, sir.
thank you. Exceptional presentation. I really appreciate the fact that you're highlighting these important conversations around being an MSI and all the other attributes that we have. But more importantly, I appreciate that this space has educated all of us on the significance of our roles and how we can better support our students. And so I think I'm walking away from this presentation with a greater understanding of how I can include my narrative, my personal voice, and my space into the classroom. And so to Dr. Ricon's point about community building and the artwork that's being shared, we know that for many of our students, when they see negative artifacts, for example, I'm coming from an institution, University of Illinois, as a graduate student, where there are negative artifacts on the campus. Still to this day, after numerous lawsuits that still exist. But we know that those type of quote unquote art pieces negatively impact student learning. And that's just in the example of Indigenous students. So I really appreciated that conversation around art, but in a positive light. Because typically when we think about art, we automatically think graffiti and it's bad and it's all these other deficit type things. But I always caution people to say that graffiti is art and there is a story behind that. And you don't know the story behind that graffiti or behind those art pieces or whatever that may be. So really exceptional presentation. I think you answered many of my questions that I previously had. So thank you. Well done.
Thank you. And thank you, Jamil, Dr. Johnson. I appreciate, and I do want to underscore that piece of Dr. Rincon's presentation in which she particularly noted the need around deconstructing as well as simultaneously reconstructing these spaces, right? And I think I'm reading Equity Walk, Equity Talk in preparation for next semester, Ben Simone's work, and the definition of equity-mindedness. So when we enact equity-minded leadership, equity-minded practices can only be situated on the recognition that we have to address historical discrimination and systemic racism. We can't just slap a coat of paint on stuff, metaphorically speaking, right? So we really do need to allow ourselves the space to be uncomfortable in these conversations. And that was a reference and one of our takeaways from our last session. We really do. We risk more harm if we don't take that time now. Other questions? Feel free to type in the chat box as well.
Well, let me just add my appreciation as well. I've really enjoyed both these discussions and the reading that you shared for this week, and appreciate these other references. One of the things that we do bump up against that I'd be interested in your thoughts on is the federal restrictions related to targeting initiatives to specific race or ethnic groups. And for example, we've had some instances where we've had people who want to develop scholarships to support the success of particular racial or ethnic groups. And the General Counsel's office has essentially told us that we can't do that. And I'm wondering kind of thoughts, and if you even have readings on that, I'd be interested in seeing those, because that's a common issue that we have bumped up against as we've thought about strategies to close equity gaps and remedy some of these historical injustices.
Thank you, Dr. Hebe. I'm going to go ahead and take the first part of this question if Dr. Watts wants to actually go into. So I think that there are a couple of different things that we might tackle with that question. The first is, before we start any initiative, I think we do need to go to council and get a sense of like, what are the legal parameters, right? So that's the first one. Before we build something, make sure that we understand what we're building. The second piece is that there are ways in which we could center Latinx, for example, or API students research, for example, that any student could apply to. Because we want to highlight just doing research that impacts these communities, and it wouldn't be specific to only those groups of students doing that work, right? Because we're in Las Vegas, like all of us have a responsibility to addressing the needs of our community. And so that would be one way of doing it, right? And I think that this would also create, and when I teach my class on understanding MSIs, I think some of the white students who enroll might have some hesitancy around what their role is as a student who attends an MSI, right? And I think that allows some ownership around like, well, how can I advance this work and do it in an ethical way, in a responsible way? So that's my feedback. Dr. Watson?
Yeah, I would add, and I appreciate your attendance, Provost Hebe, and you've been a student in the front row. I appreciate that greatly, because I know we're all busy, so I'm not going to just default to that. But I would add, perhaps this is the time for us to have these conversations around with council. What does it mean to have equity-minded practices, and to begin to unpack and disaggregate elements of policy, right? Because that's key and critical, and begin to really do that in ways that allow us, not to stumble when we do roll out initiatives, and rather to situate more firmly in equity-minded practices for all.
So I'm seeing the comment from Vanessa, and I wanted to add that for folks who are engaged in studying MSIs, you might be aware that there are changes to how the federal government is positioning what constitutes servingness. And some of that has been the inclusion of scholars like Dr. Gina Garcia, Dr. Rob Teranish in those conversations. And so there is a targeting, for example, in Department of Education grants now moving forward, as well as conversations with NSF around some of their grants about how it can target Latinx students, but also thinking beyond that, right? Like our API students and students of color that we serve on campus. This is a race conscious designation, but HSIs and NPZs don't only serve Latinx students, right? Or API students. They serve largely as access institutions for students of color in general. But I do think that we're moving in that direction. Like, I think there are some questions that institutions have been raising to the federal government around that, because scholars have critiqued the fact that most of our HSI and NPZ funding has gone to like support white faculty development around how to better serve them, and hasn't necessarily been targeted towards the students who provide us those designations. So I have already seen changes in some of those calls, and I'm almost 100% sure that we're going to continue seeing those changes.
Additional questions, folks?
And I'll just add one more second. And thank you for your work on the artwork. I learned about those murals recently. We were reviewing them. And we do have a new one that's coming in the center of campus on what's called the Tech Building, which is sort of kitty corner to the library. And so I think that's going to be done within the next few months. So it's exciting to see that artwork better representing the diversity on our campus.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Provost.
Chris.
So I'm looking
Randy,
at the,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I'm looking at the chat. Goodness, the sensor drives me crazy. Are you aware of work that discusses specific effort strategies to enhance servingness at the department unit level specifically? Yes. So I think while even this framework is situated within the campus, like largely, I think there are ways to think about what that would look like at the department level. For example, if I take the example of the higher education program, I think we're beginning to think about like, okay, well, where were we maybe a couple of years ago as it related to enrolling, higher ed and student affairs professionals of color, and then how do we move towards servingness? And we look at the various levers in our power. So what does that look like in terms of the GRE requirement, right? What does this look like in terms of our curriculum? What does this look like in terms of hiring practices? We have a search coming up. How do we enact servingness through the call itself, right? And position community engaged scholarship as being critical to the type of person that we want our students to be able to engage with. So I think there are ways to think about, well, what are the various levers that we have for change within our departments and as faculty, and how do we better utilize those levers towards servingness? And if you want to send me an email, I can send you a couple of readings that are specific to like faculty and work that's being done at the department level.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I would include all of the readings of Gina Garcia. She has done amazing work, and her books. One of my former students is now a provost, University of Laverne, and in my just coffee talks with him pretty regularly, he's now charged his department chair, so they're doing a collective read of both of her books, most recent books, and then unpacking how that work can be used to make significant changes in their units. So there are lots of things out there that can be used, but I would direct you to Gina Garcia's work.
Yeah, there's a book in particular, not the one that we read in my class, but there's one called HSIs in Practice that includes administrators that are engaged in, that were hired to do HSI work. And so you see how different folks then take on that work in everything from like rebranding the university to thinking about curriculum. So they really tackle different facets of the university. I think it's a really good book in thinking about like, well, the Becoming HSIs book is a really great theoretical book. And then this book is more of like, well, okay, so how does this look like in practice? What are other institutions doing that we might be able to do to not reinvent the wheel, as Dr. Futrell shared in his comment.
Thank you so much for that. That's super helpful.
Well, folks, we have reached 11:01, and Dr. Barlow's experiencing some technical issues on her end, so her mics are not working. We've had gremlins in our office, so our computers, our mics, and cameras have been really funny. But we wanted to again thank all of you for joining us today for this great information. Thank you so much, Dr. Watson and Dr. Ricon, for the wonderful information that you have shared and the opportunity to shed light and gain insightful information on minority serving institutions and the work that we have ahead of us to do. Thank you all for being here this morning and joining us. And we look forward to next month with our in-person Professor Circle at the Faculty Center. So thank you so much. Have a great and blessed day, and we will see you soon.
Department level,
Yes. All right.